Okay. Good day, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this Wednesday, the 20th of January, which is an important date for DevOps webinars, among other things. We have a great webinar lined up for you today, and we appreciate you taking your time out of today to join with us. And if you're watching this on demand after the fact, thank you for doing so as well, and we hope you'll be able to get a lot out of what promises to be a great discussion. Today's roundtable, it's a DevOps Unbound episode, and it's titled Avoiding SolarWinds-like Threats, the Impact Across DevOps Teams. Before I get into that and introduce what is an amazing cast of contributors for today, let me just take a quick moment, go over our GoToWebinar control system with you, because a really big part of these DevOps Unbound roundtables is interacting with the audience. And in order to do so, our GoToWebinar control panel is our means of interaction. So for most of you, this GoToWebinar control panel is going to be in the top right-hand corner of your screen. And you'll see it's broken into different sections. I wanted to call your attention to the section marked questions. And if you could hit the little arrow or a caret just to make it downward facing, you'll see it. Hopefully that wasn't me making that noise, but anyway, expanding the question section will allow you to go in there and actually type your questions in real time. We are really excited to get questions from you because in many ways, you, the audience, drive the direction of today's roundtable discussion. So please put your questions in there. We'll try to get them. If we get so many questions that I can't get the panel to answer them all, we do have a record of it. We can get you answers after the fact if possible. And this way everyone's question deserves an answer. So if you could put it in there, we really appreciate it. Now, I will ask you though that just use the question section for questions. If you have tech support issues, however, your video's not working, the audio is going in and out or something, you have some other technical issue, but you're still able to get to the chat section of the GoToWebinar control panel. We do have folks in there who will help you bring this all together. And they'll do their best, to fix whatever it is. And of course, if not, you'll be able to watch it on demand, but we'll try our best. As part of that on demand, obviously today's webinar is being recorded and it should be available on demand, usually within an hour or two of our live event ending. You can get that usually on devops.com, on digitalanarchist.com, our video platform, the library, along with just about every webinar we've ever done here at MediaOps. Okay, before we also start, I do also want to give a huge shout out to our friends at Tricentis. Tricentis are the sponsors of DevOps Unbound. And more than just sponsoring, they really help us in terms of finding great panel members like we have today, in terms of helping us decide, what are the topics that you folks out here want to listen to and talk about. And so really they play a big role in DevOps Unbound. So shout out to Tricentis for that. I see our first comment in our question sections are greetings from Poland, from Adam. Greetings to you. We will get to your questions in a moment. Let me first introduce our great panel here. So it's our topic today is avoiding SolarWinds-like threats, the impact across DevOps teams. I'm really happy to be joined by, first of all, Caroline Wong, who super excited, came last second. Our friend Chenzi Wong was unable to make it today due to some technical difficulties. We reached out to Caroline, and as always, she came through in the clutch for us. Caroline, welcome. If you wouldn't mind, give the people a little of your background.
Sounds great. Thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to be here with this group. My name is Caroline Wong. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at Cobalt.io. We're a pen test as a service company. I actually started my DevSecOps career 15 or so years ago, leading information security teams at eBay and at Zynga. These were super cool places to be working in cybersecurity. In both cases, we were running online operations 24/7 with millions of simultaneous users daily. Since then, I've held a variety of different roles in product, in consulting, and at Cobalt, I'm proud to be at my first cybersecurity startup.
Excellent. I'm moving my microphone here, probably not a good idea. Okay, next up, I'd like to introduce you to Bhavin Patel, who's with Tricentis. Bhavin, why don't you give us a little background?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Bhavin. I am the head of product security here at Tricentis. I actually enjoy what I do in security, so it's uncommon to find people in that demographic doing fun things. So I've had fun in my career. I've kind of shaped up a lot of pen testing and exploit development. So if you have any hacking questions, feel free to reach out to me. I've also done a lot of securing the architecture with builds for API platforms. And I've also been on the other side of breach response. So what happens when things go sideways? How to react to such situations. So this topic is very intriguing to me, and I look forward to collaborating with y'all. Thanks.
Fantastic, thank you and welcome, Bhavin. Next up is our friend Julian Waits for no man. And Julian, well, I know your title, but I'm going to let you introduce yourself if you don't mind.
Well, thank you very much, Alan. First, I have to apologize. I live in a condo building, and apparently one of my neighbors has decided to start doing some form of construction work. So if the drilling starts, I'll just mute. I don't know what to say. This is welcome to the world of COVID and working from home, right? So obviously, Julian Waits. I'm the general manager for cybersecurity and for public sector at Devo Security Inc. We are a security data analytics scene company. We have very large customers in the market. We focus on very complex situations. Notably, we recently won the Central SIEM for the United States Air Force. However, my passions in life go way beyond work and security. I'm also the chairman of an organization called the International Consortium of Minority Cybersecurity Professionals. Say that 100 times real fast, well, even 5 times real fast. We focus on introducing women and people of color in cybersecurity. And in case you hadn't noticed, the saxophone in the back, I'm also an amateur jazz musician. So those are the things I love to do.
Fantastic. Next up is my friend Richard Steenan, who really needs no introductions to any cybersecurity audience. But Richard, why don't you give him a little background?
Sure, thanks, Alan. I've been thinking about, just what is my background, and I realized way back when Alan and Mitch and I were all blogging about cybersecurity. I know you guys still do. I kind of felt I was taking on the role of historian, right? Because I was reporting real time on all these threats, which happen to be the driver for industry. But professionally, I'm an industry analyst. So while I keep my eyes on that industry driver of threat actors, I started researching a couple years ago and then writing a history of the security industry itself. And I specifically left all the threats out of that book. But I'm updating that book, Security Yearbook, every single year. And of course, the drivers that occur each year, and in this case, SolarWinds is going to be a big part of that, right? Because we have the year of 2020 was bookended by COVID and its impact on our working relationship with our companies, working from home, and then SolarWinds right at the end of the year. So it was a momentous year for cybersecurity. COVID didn't slow down the industry's growth. It did in the first 6 months, but everything popped back starting in June and July. So it's going to be interesting to look forward to 2021 in that lens.
Absolutely. And thanks for joining us, Richard. And Richard, I always say, is very humble when he talks about his background. Richard is probably, well, as he says, except for Charles Kalaji, he's the longest serving security analyst in the world, going back beyond 2000, and one of the key people of putting together Gartner's At the time, it was information security practice. I don't think we called it cyber then. But thanks for joining, Richard. Last but not least is my co-host and partner, Mitch Ashley. Mitchell is the CEO for Accelerated Strategies Group Analysts Company, as well as CTO at MediaOps, and as well as co-host of DevOps Unbound. Hey, Mitchell, welcome. I went and gave your background, but why don't you finish it up from there?
Yeah, I was just going to add, you were talking about how long we've been doing this. I installed my first firewall in '98, which was Gauntlet on Slackware. So that tells you it's been a while. I've been doing cybersecurity and also cloud and of course DevOps in the mid 2010s or so, whatever year it was, probably 13. So it's a great subject, and I've had the pleasure of working with Richard and Alan and a whole bunch of other folks that we're all know each other very well. It's a great industry to be a part of, and great to be here today with Alan and all of you. And by the way, I'm not going to be undone by Julian. So there you go, Julian.
Hey, if this thing doesn't work out, we could all. Does anyone sing here? Oh, Richard's got the keyboard too.
I got the keyboard.
All right, drums, bobbing, anything here? Okay. All right.
Oh no, Unlimited is just hacking, unfortunately.
Anyway, all right, good stuff, guys. So let's jump into things, right? Avoiding SolarWinds-like threats. Well, we can't avoid SolarWinds-like threats until we understand the nature of beast here, of what we were talking about. And I want to say from the outset, and I think I speak for all of our panel members, that this is not meant, we say a SolarWinds-like threat. Blaming SolarWinds for this is kind of ludicrous, right? These kinds of, as we call them, supply chain attacks, or what happened here with SolarWinds, it could happen to any of us. It could happen to any of you out there in your organizations. We're all susceptible. We all can be the next SolarWinds, right? So let's make that clear from the outset. But, you know, Julian, I'm going to ask you if you don't mind, and then I'd throw it to Richard. For purposes of you know, framing the conversation, how would you describe what happened here with the SolarWinds SolarFlare attack?
Sure.
Category.
So again, the reason we call it a supply chain attack, because that sounds really complicated. I talk to people about it and they're like, what does that mean? It's like 3 or 4 vendors stacked on top of each other. No, it just means that it's a threat introduced through something that you're using in your environment that typically you purchase. It's a part of the supply chain of how you receive services. I think what makes this one so unique is the fact that it happened through the update server that SolarWinds was using. And to the point that you made before, Alan, and I want to make sure that I make this clear, this could have happened to anyone. I mean, as always, when the incursion occurs and the whole thing comes out, we can find 100 reasons for what everybody did wrong. But let's face it, every threat that we see in the market, even when everybody's done everything right, if you're a target, you know, the attack surface is just way too porous, something's going to happen. Always a question about what the response is going to be. And so in this case, obviously it happened where it's an update server. The update server uses a service called SAML, which is used for authentication. As people move more and more to the cloud, that cloud transformation, which uses SAML primarily as its authentication service, allowed people to get in with privileged access, primarily through Azure services and Microsoft 365 email. Once that penetration occurred, it was only a matter of time before you get more privileged accounts, and wham, boom, you know, look at what happens. All my critical information is going outside of my environment. Of course, what makes this one even worse is because SolarWinds was such a successful software company, they permeated much of the infrastructure in the US and other countries, and so it's a massive attack. I mean, I hope that helps.
I think it does. Richard, anything to add?
Yeah, you know, I look at this, especially when our topic is how to avoid or counter or respond to SolarWinds type attacks. There's 2 aspects, right? One is the supply chain side, SolarWinds getting breached and for pushing out updates that were accepted. And how do you address that, right? And I've thought about that a long time, ever since we saw Flame, which was a piece of malware that was installed with a signed certificate from Microsoft. And how did that happen? The NSA would use it in order to get that installed on their very, very specific target. So it wasn't a widespread attack like SolarWinds. And then we saw the sandworm attacks in Ukraine that followed the almost exact same methodology, right? They compromised an update service for a accounting software package, pretty predominantly used only in Ukraine. And once that got out, it was wormified, or basically it spread from machine to machine once it got a foothold inside an organization. So very, very destructive attack. And it spread around the world, and that was the NotPetya attack. And now we've got hopefully a cyber espionage campaign that, yes, spread to many, many end users, 18,000 different companies of the Orion product, but hopefully just a few hundred of those targets were selected for further activity by the attackers, who most of us are attributing to the SRB, the spy agency for Russia. So two different aspects. If we talk about the SolarWinds problems, right? So they probably got attacked through a classic spear phishing attack. And the one thing that the DevOps people should start looking at now, and maybe finally, a good example of why you have to start doing DevSecOps, is that the attackers manage to infiltrate and get on the desktops and workstations of the developers, and then install their own updates into the code they're working on. So they weren't even, checking software out, updating it themselves, and checking it back in. They were allowing the end users, the developers, to actually be their avenue of attack on the update server. So lots of places in there that you could start doing better security to avoid that happening if you are a supplier to a bunch of companies. The other question, how do you avoid downloading malicious software from a trusted supplier? Much more difficult question. I'm not sure I know the answer to that. I'm thinking about all these, update your signing certificates every hour instead of, once every 3 years. Maybe that would help, but I don't know.
Cell phone.
We have a gardener outside our office here with the leaf blower thing. I
Oh,
may have to give him away. But all right, Richard.
can I add to that, Alan?
Excuse me?
Can I add to that, Alan? What Richard
Yeah, good.
talked about? I think there's another layer of the onion to peel back, and this is really plays into the DevOps world, because yes, it's compromising the update server. Yes, it's receiving compromised software, but this actually got into the tool chain aspect of building the software. That's how the sunburst backdoor got into the update server that then got pushed out. And it was a very sophisticated attack or method of applying the malware, because not only did they get into the tool chain process, but they actually did things to watch when a build started, and then examined the parameters that were provided on the command that started the build, looked for a certain piece of code that was going to be part of that build, put their own in place of it. They did things to encrypt the log. They did things to, like, they didn't kill any process to draw any attention to themselves. They were very conscious of not drawing attention to what they were doing to any of the developers. So they worked very hard at it. And they used a lot of things to keep track of what was going on and how to decide when to do what and not when to act. So it was a sophisticated process. And I think something like that could happen to any of us in our building of software and building the tool chain that creates whatever software we push out the door, whether it goes onto an update server or to people's desktops or wherever it goes.
Absolutely. Carolyn, I wanted to ask you from an AppSec sort of perspective, because you're the AppSec expert on here, right? Yes, supply chains happen, supply chain attacks happen. I always thought that those kinds of things would have been caught with a pre-deployment or notice at a pre-deployment level. Are we, is that putting too much on AppSec, or what do you think?
So I'm gonna kind of bring something a little different to this conversation. I think that's why it's fun to have people with different perspectives on these types of calls. We've been talking a lot about how this attack was super sophisticated, right? It takes skill to make malware. It takes skill to get that malware on an update server. I agree with those things. There was a Business Insider article published last month. The headline says, a security expert reportedly warned SolarWinds in 2019 that anyone could access the company's update server with the password SolarWinds123. Security misconfiguration remains a huge problem. It is not a problem that is impossible to fix. There are known ways to harden our environments. Yes, if you steal the admin's password, yes, if you can get onto the company's update server, then it's relatively easy to deploy a chained exploit. At that point, it's super hard to find, but it is not hard to configure things securely. It's not easy, but it's not impossible. And so I think that we all have an opportunity from an AppSec perspective to demand more transparency from our supply chains, and more frequently. I work for a company that builds security software. We've got dozens of vendors. We've got hundreds of customers. The whole software industry is interconnected in this way. We used to say 15 years ago that security was kind of like if Mitch and I are running away from a bear, I don't have to outrun the bear, I just have to outrun Mitch. That's not
too
true.
hard to do either, by the way.
Maybe it wasn't true then. It is certainly not true now. Today, it's like a three-legged race. Mitch and I are in this together. Our legs are tied together. My success depends on his success. This is what the example I'm about to share is completely different, right? But on January 4th, after taking a couple weeks off for winter vacation, I log on. I happen to be in the PST time zone. Slack is down. Slack is down, and Slack is something major that both the employees at Cobalt as well as our customers and our pen testers use. This is another just in your face example of how dependent we are on each other. And so I think what we need from AppSec is more transparency and more frequent transparency.
Fair enough. Bobbin, we haven't heard from you, but what Caroline's talking about, easily, simple passwords, misconfigurations, simple stuff. I mean, they're the hacker's best friend, right? You kind of count on these kind of weak links.
Agreed. Yeah. Just echoing off of Caroline. I mean, the security landscape is ever changing. So what security hardening does today is definitely going to change tomorrow. You always have to have that hacker mindset that there's only one way to get in, but you being the supplier, you have to kind of ensure that your software is packaged securely. So I've seen some questions. One of them was from Mikhail about secure binaries. Secure binaries is also a good way to kind of secure your code as part of the supply chain. But the question is also doing checksums for people when they're downloading those software for patches. In this case, SolarWinds, like validating checksums. But as you alluded to, Mitch, with looking at the build pipeline, how do we secure code as part of the build pipeline? And that's looking at your integration of automated security testing. So do you have the appropriate security tools in place to check for maintenance hooks as part of threat modeling and security architecture, to automate security testing tools with static code, dynamic code, and interactive code analysis tools? And then eventually, when you're packaging the code and shipping it out as a supplier, having it pen tested and kind of do some reverse engineering or secure code reviews. a lot of companies are doing parts and pieces of those, but as part of the DevOps pipeline, we should be looking at security review and security testing, and collectively ensuring that we're publicizing an appropriate security posture before we give it to our consumers. If you're looking from a consumer perspective, you're kind of looking at twofold. One is how to secure supply chain attack for all my vendors. A lot of that kind of ties into building a vendor management program and partnership procurement with legal to make sure you have the language in place in case such a breach occurs, but also having the technical capabilities of doing proactive evaluations. So when you're doing a vendor security risk assessment, having a tiering system potentially, and then building upon it. So I've seen that successful in my endeavors when I've done that at NCR and Finastra and other companies that I've worked for. But having a vendor portfolio is key to kind of doing sustainable periodic testing. Tier 1 vendors, tier 2 vendors are your high-hanging fruit. They have a high impact in the environment. It's also ensuring that you're doing active penetration testing or requesting penetration testing reports for adoption. So looking at potentially high critical risk findings within those products that you consume, but also looking at partnering with other firms. If you don't have that capability in-house, how do you use your vendor management profile? So if you have a one-man shop or two-man shop with security, it's unscalable to manage 200 vendors inside your company. So the idea behind it is getting some consulting services to kind of partner with and have them do the technical evaluation. You offset that burden, it's a trade-off, but at the same time, you have the people that are in the industry today to support you in vendor risk.
Yeah, right on. Guys, we got a ton of questions already from the audience. We have to jump in here. So, Adam asked if closed source solutions would prove to be more efficient in dealing with sunburst tier malware, right? And so, this is kind of been a reoccurring problem is, closed source is more secure than open source. Of course, we've seen the pendulum on the other side of things. Open source is more secure than closed source. I've seen arguments back and forth on these over the years. To me, this isn't really an open source, closed source.
It isn't.
Issue here.
It can happen either way.
I absolutely. I just don't think it.
I think
one's been good.
Well, I was gonna comment. I think it's a combination of what Bob and what Carolyn said, right? The big issue is obviously consumers from the standpoint of vendor management should demand more from us, the vendors, not just the security vendors, but the specific tier 1 applications that they're using in their environment around what are they doing in their CI/CD pipelines, to Richard's point, which is truly DevSecOps. At the end of the day, to Carolyn's point, again, not to throw SolarWinds under the bus, SolarWinds should have caught the problem. I think having more ethical hacking and pen test done on a regular basis, which is a part of cyber hygiene, has to be a core component of what we do. It always amazes me how some of the companies that are the sloppiest about security are companies that provide security-oriented technologies. And so I think that becomes most important. But this is no different than if the operating system is hacked. Or let's face it, there's a new patch out for Microsoft-oriented technologies every day where somebody finds something either through a bug bounty type situation or however it occurs, where Microsoft has to move very quickly to fix the problem, because there's always going to be some vulnerability there, some vulnerability. But if somebody told you, a year before, hey, there's an easy way to break into your software and you should do something about it, and you don't, you're just asking for the problem to occur.
I have to agree. All right. Let's continue with questions from the audience.
One more thing on open source, Alan. I started thinking about this in terms of but everybody in their DevOps incorporates open source libraries, right? And you don't update them every time there's a new feature. You only update them when there's a new feature you need. But say that happens and you download it, but because the attackers had access to the open source, they went in and they changed something as simple as the way random numbers are generated. that could immediately, break all of the security you're incorporating into your code that's used for encrypting or generating those random numbers. So there could be some extremely widespread attacks via open source. And open source, nobody's paying to have, one of the firms here test it constantly and for every single update. So that's a concern for me anyways.
Yeah, fair enough. Another from the audience, another question from Mihail. What strategy would you recommend to avoid SolarWinds-like threats? Would signing update binaries be by the vendor and verifying these at the endpoint be a good idea? Or perhaps also filtering the update packages through an IPS? You know what? I don't know if either one of those would have worked here, because my understanding was it was signed by the vendor.
Yeah,
It was
we
signed.
signed it after the build, so the sign would be accurate. The issue is,
Yeah,
Checksums
the
were fine,
and then
signing was fine.
the IPS. I
No,
don't think that picks.
It was even so sophisticated that it had a sandbox evasion that it wouldn't trigger for 2 weeks after it was installed. Up to 2 weeks is random.
I
So you
didn't know
couldn't
that.
test it. You couldn't test it for 2 weeks.
maybe this is a ridiculous idea, but it's almost like we need to pen test our tool chains. I don't know how else you catch this until you find, someone reports there's code in here doing something that we shouldn't be doing.
I
I don't
want
think
to
that's
add to
I agree with
something. I want to add to something that Julian said, which is it has to do with understanding what vendors, supplies, and products do you depend on, and have you performed a risk ranking exercise to understand which of those holds, the keys to the kingdom, right? If you've got a vendor and they're displaying some graphics or whatever, or a blog, maybe that's sort of less critical than if you've got one that's updating into your code. And if that's the case, then like Bhavin said, you do more security controls, you do threat modeling, you do manual pen testing to identify chained exploits. I think it's fascinating actually that as an industry, we have recognized the seemingly infinite amount of information security work that there is to be done and leaned so heavily on automated solutions that there's stuff that can't be automated. You can't
Right.
automatically detect a chained exploit. You actually need human intelligence and creativity to determine a chained exploit. You actually need human intelligence and creativity to conduct a threat model. And while sometimes historically some of these things we don't do them because they're expensive and or hard, some of that's changing. And in the meantime, what we have to do is we have to identify the super important stuff and do all the application security things to the super important stuff. We can no longer determine our application security controls by budgets only, by compliance only. It actually has to be done in a risk-based manner.
100%.
I agree.
I qual at the idea of doing that to Oracle financials. You're a little law firm or something, and you happen to be using them, or manufacturer, be more likely. Oracle's not going to help you with that process.
So we as an industry have an opportunity to band together, right? How many customers does Oracle have? I don't know the answer to that. I bet it's a lot. So this little law firm with relatively little cash to spend on this problem has the same problem as thousands, maybe tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of others. And so we have an opportunity to say, vendor security, supply chain security, it doesn't have to be one-to-one all over the place. It can be one-to-N. We have an opportunity as an industry to change this, but it is going to require a difference in the way that we work.
So that's the transparency you were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, but one thing we've learned in security, it's kind of like the NFL. In the NFL, they say once one defensive coordinator has figured out your offense, the whole league figures out your offense. We see copycat kind of attacks frequently in security. So now everybody is moving to the supply chain attack. It's become the new black, right? The new sexy attack is going to be the supply chain attack. Are we going to see a bevy of supply chain attacks now?
Absolutely.
Yeah, Julian?
Yeah, yeah, without question. I think we certainly, for the foreseeable future, you'll see copycat attacks like this. And the reason is just the elegance of it, right? To the point that we've all been making. Remember, it wasn't just an attack on SolarWinds. It's an attack on a product that requires high privileged access to do the work that it needs to do in your environment. I get a legitimate cert in the process to do the SAML, and now theoretically, with very little work, I have access to the world. Why wouldn't I do more of these? This is a big payoff for you know, I wouldn't say a minimal investment, but not a huge sizable investment.
So I maintain SolarWinds is a copycat attack. Who can name the attack that it was almost exactly copying?
It was a Microsoft attack, and I can't think of the name of it now.
Well, that was the Flame one.
Golden
but anyways,
Samuel. I don't.
So the 2004 Summer Olympics in Athens. You guys remember that one?
I do.
So,
Yeah.
multiple updates over 6 months to some Ericsson switches run by the telco in Athens, and finally the last update, you know, installed the back doors so that they could listen to 100 different people's cell phone conversations. And then, interestingly enough, the engineer who was in charge of the updates, putting the updates into the Ericsson switches, was found hanging in his apartment 3 days after we learned of the event. So
wow.
Maybe not a copycat, maybe just a reuse by the same organization. I don't know.
But great drama there, Richard. That could be a movie.
Yeah.
Probably will be one day.
Yeah. But so the question is if we know that now we're going to be seeing, you know, supply chain attacks coming, what can we do proactively get out ahead of these things without appearing like the French, you know, setting up a Maginot Line to fight the last war instead of the next war? Anybody?
I think Bobbin hit it on the head earlier with what are you putting inside of your development pipeline to look for stuff like this? I mean, this once you know, shame on me that I got caught once, but in the security industry, it's not the third time. It can't happen the second time. So they might get you another way, but they should not be able to get you this way.
Correct.
I agree, Julian. I think that's a bit of the tragedy of this being called a supply chain attack. Yes, it was in terms of where it was delivered to, but the attack, other than getting through the update server, infiltrating the DevOps tool chain, the software build tool, that's the key here. That's what really
unique
made this powerful and made it hard to detect. And I think it's going to be really easy for us to gloss over that and say, oh, supply chain, that's the issue. Well, yeah, it's one of the issues this illuminated for everyone, but it's really software build process and the security of that. That's what I'm worried about. Nobody's thinking about.
True. Sounds like a market opportunity.
It does, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, just to echo off of that and kind of build upon identifying incident of compromise and attacks within your company, it's also continuous learning, right? So what we see today is, since SolarWinds is such a prominent, you know, incident in the world, you're going to see a lot of people shifting their mindset into building more run books from responses to kind of combat this. So I see evolution in incident response coming out of this as well. How do you handle supply chain attacks? Because as they come on the rise, companies and organizations need to mimic the trend of, you know, how do we get a legal response, public relations folks involved? How do we ensure that our technical aptitude for threat hunting, you know, partnering with your forensics third-party teams to actually do these roundtables? I mean, actually they're called tabletop exercises, excuse me, to kind of bake in this kind of incident and do a tabletop exercise at least annually, even quarterly, you know, per product portfolio. you're going to see more bigger aspects on your product rollout. So if you're the supplier of products, how do you, in this instance, secure against such attacks within your own supply chain? I don't want my consumers to be, breached through my products. So for ideally putting myself in their shoes is like, how do I ensure, sophisticated hackers are not encapsulating secure wrappers in my payload and pushing it as part of my build pipeline? So it's going to be more sheep dip analogy, just taking that sheep, dipping it more vigorously, kind of taking that analogy further and actually doing it maybe 2 or 3 times on a periodic basis to kind of combat malware and security payloads and such attacks coming into the situation as we saw today.
Interesting. The Gold Reg from our audience suggests maybe that going more serverless is a way to avoid these kinds of things. If we use serverless as a way to develop function as a service, help get rid of infrastructure, would that prevent these kinds of attacks? I'm not so sure, quite frankly. I don't think that's going to help you.
I worry
Honestly,
about
I got a good example. If you look at MageCart, that happened, I think it was 2017. It wasn't actually impact on the server; it was actually impacted on demand. So with MageCart, they actually had their supply chain hacked, and the fact that they had the DOM that was on a client laptop being encapsulated. So when people were going to e-commerce page checkout, they indirectly put in their credit card numbers, but as they click submit, there was another payload that was copying that credit card and pushing it off to a different supply chain, command and control server. So if you're looking at supply chain, it's not going to be directly on the server itself. It could definitely be on the client side. So expect that to come. Even though we look at serverless computing, supply chain is definitely going to, it's going to have different variations.
Yeah, absolutely. Another person from our audience, Mike, brings up, in all the discussion around SolarWinds and how this happened and supply chain attacks, what there hasn't been a lot of discussion about is the repercussions to the customers. So yes, this opened the back door, but as a result of that back door, what have the bad guys, what kind of other malware, what have been the results of this backdoor? What other attacks and damages have we seen yet? Or are we still kind of waiting for that other shoe to drop, right?
Only time will tell is the other shoe.
Yeah, I agree. Has anyone seen concrete attacks that have taken? I mean, I know with our government how much was compromised and so forth, but what do we, what can we expect to see, or what have we seen?
Yeah, all we know is that they pivoted into Office 365 in many cases with the purpose of being able to read email. And now we're left with, so everybody at Treasury, everybody at DHS, CISA had their email.
EOD.
Yeah.
I mean, here's what I can say. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. I apologize, Richard.
No, that's right.
Here's what I can say about that, right? I think it is we are waiting for the other shoe, because obviously it moved from SolarWinds to the authentication mechanism to actual email and creating additional accounts with privileges. And so the real question becomes for most of these organizations, and it goes back to what Carolyn said earlier, if I know I have something like this in my environment and there's a potential for it to take hold of stuff, what's the stuff that's most important to whatever the business is that I'm in? If it's the military, it's forward troop movements. It's what are things that we're planning to do in the near future that we don't want our enemies to know about. If it's a a retailer, how do I make sure I lock down those credit card numbers, because I know that they're after that, because they may be in my environment looking at it. So more importantly, it becomes a risk discussion than it becomes an incident response discussion. That comes second.
I think it's possible that what we're seeing now and what we know about now is just like steps 1 through 3 out of like a 10-step chain to exploit. I think that this is just the attacker. This is like extended recon, potentially. And that is, terrifying.
Speaking of which, I think it just came out today, Malwarebytes is the next security company that was affected by the same attack.
Really?
So, yeah, it just came out this morning. So Microsoft
That's why-
Fire, CrowdStrike, now Malwarebytes. So clearly there's a pattern here for going
Well,
after.
but that's my point, right?
Yeah.
These are all technologies that literally we trust to provide protection to us, to eliminate the malware, and they're the ones that are being infiltrated. So again, it does raise the question for the consumer of the technologies, or even technologies like DevOps, where I work. What are you guys doing better to protect the data that I'm giving you custodianship of?
Agreed. Again, from the audience, Larry wants to know why don't CIS controls or other benchmarks, COSO controls, why do they ignore automation of mandatory testing of all accounts for all devices in DevOps and the chain? There's no way SolarWinds 1, 2, 3 would have survived that scrutiny. But auditors don't even put a basic technique as a pen tester would do when they grab passwords, hashes, and get 40+% passwords in under an hour. And he cites some sources for that. Caroline, this is kind of in your sweet spot. Bhavin, probably you as well. Would that have helped here? I mean, obviously, yeah, we could always, make our CIS controls better. But is that really the answer here?
So I think there is a way that security teams ask for and get budget and allocate that budget for a security program. And one of the drivers for that comes from various compliance frameworks, various requirements. So maybe what this question is really asking is, can't we just get it in the compliance frameworks that you have to identify all of the misconfigurations? I think the reality of security practitioners is they're always trying to do more with less. And as we mentioned, stuff like threat modeling and manual pen testing historically has been expensive. And so you've had to make these difficult decisions. I do think that's changing. I think that's changing because you see things like you see cybersecurity experts on boards of companies. I think it's changing because you see changes in the control and the distribution and the procurement models of things like manual pen testing. So I think that, doing stuff the way that we've done it for the past 10, 20, 30 years and just doing the same thing is not going to cut it. But I do see sort of industry trends moving in a different direction.
Correct. Yeah, I just to echo off of Caroline, I'm aligned with that. If you're looking at the transition for Gartner Hype Cycle as of last year with application security, there's been an influx and rise in API consumption on the web. We're moving away from standardized HTTP portals and configurations. So a lot of machine learning is coming into play. Now, machine learning in development and in innovation is key, but also machine learning and security. So having the ability to detect payload ciphers with backdoor capabilities is key. And there are some vendors out there. If you look at some of them that are pioneering in that innovation sector, they could actually be part of your DevSecOps pipeline. How do you react to API threat prevention within your supply chain? Just having some of those capabilities and solutions in place. If you look at it, we've talked about vetting, we've talked about monitoring, but we also need to look at how do we audit, and how we audit is also key. So even if we continuously do, administrative audits, we need to do technical, on-demand, real-time audits. And I see that as being part of DevSecOps, like incorporating an API production tool, incorporating a machine learning capability in security that would actually bake in a lot of that manual work and manual upkeep and overhead that we have to do from logging and monitoring and actually get some key capabilities and highlights that impact my organization today. You know, we're always looking at the 360 profiles. Any hacker can come in from one of those 360 points. How do I get a 360 framework of my outlook today? And I think that's something we're going to look at, even in part of the product pipeline, DevSecOps pipeline. We need to find out what solutions we can automate, but then also making sure those automations are based on least privilege, based on threat modeling capabilities to shift more left in the development lifecycle. My concern is just alluding to this point and question about password SolarWinds 1 to 3. You know, that wouldn't have flown in a security architecture assessment. That wouldn't have flown in a threat modeling assessment because you would have already highlighted that as a design specification, functional specification for authentication, that you cannot implement, you know, basic authentication in that manner. So to me, this also goes back not just to build pipeline, but also looking at the security view in general.
But, you know, Bobbin, I hear what you're saying, but to a point that Carolyn made earlier, because the reason why everybody isn't doing it is not mandated and it's expensive. And so as an industry, whether it's CSA, because I do think most of this has definitely made us more vulnerable because we're all going to the cloud. How do we mandate some of these things? Because there's tons of things that could have been done. They weren't being done, and they will continue not to be done until we find a way to put in practice that there's some downside for not being proactive about stuff like this. And the industry is not doing a good job of policing itself. That's my biggest issue here, is that.
The one with the power is the buyer. Right now, we have like buyers and vendors, and we're all buyers and we're all vendors. And one way, if you're a security leader and you're having trouble getting budget, if you can have the client say, I demand this security in order to continue partnering with you, it'll happen. I think that's where we have an opportunity. When it makes the buyers hurt that much, and right now buyers are hurting, right? That's the whole thing about supply chain. When the buyers hurt enough that they demand more focus, it'll happen.
Well, to your point, you know, I now have customers who are ripping out SolarWinds with reckless abandon, meaning they don't even have anything to replace it with for the purposes it was providing for. In most cases, let's call it more systems management oriented capabilities in their environment. But they're so afraid, and they should be, of what new things can be introduced in the environment. They're just completely ripping it out. And I was talking to one customer, and I said, you know what probably would have been more proactive, because this is a very mature security environment that they're in. And I would tell you, probably one of the most secure in the world. My response is, why weren't you imposing all the same standards that you created for yourself on the vendors that are supplying you these technologies? Because it's just the next vendor. And of course, they beat the crap out of us in the process of selling to them. So you can guess which one of the customers it was. But I mean, it literally, it now is just ripping it out like crazy. Of course, it doesn't represent a security risk by taking it out per se, but it does represent other risks to their environment. So consumers have the power, to your point.
And to build off of what Carolyn said, you know, I don't price shop when I go grocery shopping, right? I don't even know how much something costs, but I know there's a minority of people who will shop at a different store if the price is a couple pennies higher for a loaf of bread. And I benefit from the amount of diligence that they put into their job. And same thing, if it doesn't take all customers to push back against the supplier, it just takes some of the customers, because the supplier wants to offer the same thing to everybody to make their life simpler. So we'll all benefit if a few buyers apply these controls.
Yeah, but you know, and I shouldn't dominate the call, but you brought up a good point. And I've said this in our executive meetings at Devo. It's amazing to me that Whole Foods has made it cool for me to spend $8 for a pound of grapes. You know, I'm just, but the reason I do it is I perceive that the benefits to me and my family and others who I may feed far outweigh buying something that I consider to be deficient to that. And so, to your point, it is also about if you're going to put more security in your product as a vendor. So speaking to vendors, well, even companies that build their own software, if I can sell those benefits, as something that better protects you, then people probably would be willing to spend a little more for it, because there's a lot of pricing pressure, you know, working for a software vendor in security space specifically, us versus, one of our major competitors. One of the things always comes up is price. And the responses that I always give is, I understand what you're saying, but you get what you pay for. Let me run you through these 3 or 4 benefits that I think are very unique to me and my competitors, versus my competitors in the market. But it's a good point.
Fair enough. Guys, we're coming up on the end of our time here. I wanted to mention, we do Amazon gift cards to a few people every webinar. We pick 4 Amazon winners. for today's show, Celeste O, Isla M, ISLAM, Mark R, and Vince P are Amazon winners. Our team will reach out to you and mail you or email you your Amazon gift cards. Thanks so much for attending. Guys, first of all, let me just say that we probably have a dozen or a dozen and a half questions in queue. And I don't think we've ever had this many questions in one of our roundtables. And I apologize we didn't get to them all on camera, but we'll get a list out and circulate it among the panel. I think the reason is we had a really great topic, a very timely topic, but we also had a really great panel. I can't thank you all enough, Bhavin, Caroline, Julian, Richard, of course, Mitchell, for participating in this. Maybe we can do a part 2 of this at some point in the future and continue the conversation. I suspect we'll be dealing with the next supply chain attacks by then as well, unfortunately, and it is what it is. But guys, thank you so much. Thank you all so much. It's just about the top of the hour. We do have a new president in the United States, which is a good thing, I guess. And I'll let everyone go watch his speech, and thank you all again for joining in with us. Okay.
Thank you.
This is Alan
everybody.
Thanks, Alan.
Thank
Thanks,
you,
everyone.
everyone. Thank you. This is Alan Schimmel for DevOps Unbound. Many thanks to Tricentis for sponsoring DevOps Unbound. We have a well, it's not a TV show, it's a video show. I'm so old. We have a video show that we do every other week called DevOps Unbound. You can catch it on our TechStrong TV program, as well as on Digital Anarchist or on DevOps.com. Check it out. Again, thanks to our panel. Thanks to you all. Take care, everyone. Have a great day. Bye-bye.